I turned 63 in April, and my daughter sent me a card with a sunflower on it. My son didn't call. I mention that because it tells you something about the kind of family I'd built, or tried to build, or allowed to be built around me while I stood there thinking I was the foundation when I was actually just the floor. My name is Leonard. I worked 31 years as a civil engineer for a county infrastructure firm in central Ohio. I'm the kind of man who reads instruction manuals before assembling furniture, who checks tire pressure before a long drive, who keeps a running file of receipts in a manila folder labeled by year. I say this not to sound boring, which I probably am, but to explain why what happened caught me so completely off guard. Not the facts of it. I saw the facts coming. What surprised me was how long I'd been looking at them without letting myself read them. My wife, my second wife, Joanna, and I married 11 years ago. She had a son from her first marriage, Philip. He was 22 when I met him, 24 when we married. Old enough to vote, old enough to drink, old enough to look a man in the eye and decide whether he was worth respecting. Philip decided early that I wasn't. He never said it directly. He said it the way some people do, with patience, with small corrections, with a tone that treated my presence in his mother's house as a clerical error that hadn't been resolved yet. His father, Joanna's ex, lived in Arizona. He sent Philip birthday texts and occasionally money in amounts that felt more like apologies than affection. Philip spoke of him the way you speak of a place you loved before it closed. Fond, mostly, uncritical always. I didn't try to replace anyone. I want to be clear about that. I knew what I was walking into. I'd done this before, in a first marriage that lasted 8 years and ended mutually and without much drama. I had a daughter from that marriage, Claire, who lived in Portland, who sent sunflower cards. I understood blended families in the way you understand weather, theoretically, until it's your weather. What I didn't understand was how a household could quietly, methodically reorganize itself around your usefulness while erasing your membership. It started small, the way these things always do. I moved into Joanna's house because it made sense. She owned it. The mortgage was paid down. It would have been foolish to sell and start over. I told myself that. I believed it. What I didn't notice was that I never stopped feeling like a guest who'd overstayed. Not because anyone said so, because no one ever said the opposite. Within the first year, Joanna asked if I could absorb the property tax payments while she redirected her income toward credit card debt from before we married. I said, of course, that's what you do. You consolidate, you streamline, you become the person who handles things because handling things is how you show love when you don't know how else to show it. Then the car. Philip needed one for a new job he'd taken outside Columbus. He didn't have the credit. Joanna asked if I'd co-sign. I did. The payment came from my account. Philip said he'd transfer his share monthly. He transferred it 4 times over the course of 2 years. I stopped mentioning it because the mention always cost more than the money. Then utilities, then the cell phone plan. Joanna wanted us on a family plan, and Philip was still on hers, so now he was on mine, 3 lines. I paid for all 3. Then Philip lost the job and needed help with rent for 6 months, while he figured things out. Then he figured things out and got an apartment, and somehow my name ended up on the lease as a guarantor because the landlord required it. Joanna said it was just a formality. A formality I signed. None of these things individually would make a reasonable person raise an alarm. You help family, you support people you love. You don't keep score in a marriage. I knew all of this. I believed all of this. I didn't notice when believing it became a strategy someone else was using. The summer, Philip announced he wanted to go back to school nursing program. 2 years, community college plus clinicals. Joanna told me at dinner, not as a question, but as news. Philip's going back to school in the fall. Isn't that great? It was great. I said so. The tuition discussion came 3 weeks later. His savings were limited. Financial aid covered about half. Joanna's income was stretched. She looked at me the way she'd learned to look at me when something needed to happen that she didn't want to ask for directly. I covered the rest, $12,000 over 2 years. I told myself it was an investment. In him, in our family, in the idea that this would eventually become something that looked like what I thought I was building. He graduated last May. There was a small ceremony. I sat in the back because the front rows filled early with Joanna's family. Nobody saved me a seat. Philip thanked his mother in his speech. He thanked his aunt. He thanked, and I am not making this up, his high school biology teacher. He looked out into that gymnasium with new diploma confidence, and my name never left his mouth. I drove home alone because I had taken my own car in case I needed to leave early. I thought about that drive for weeks afterward. There are moments when something shifts and you know it shifted, but you keep moving anyway, because stopping would require you to examine what just changed, and you're not ready for that. The graduation was one of those moments. I kept moving. I went back to work. I paid the bills that came in with my name on them. I had dinner with my wife and watched her text her son from across the table while the news played in the background. Then came September. Joanna told me her sister had invited her to come down to Savannah for a long weekend. She mentioned it on a Tuesday. She said she was leaving Friday morning. I asked if I was invited. She said her sister's place was small. I said I'd get a hotel. She said it was really more of a sister's thing. I nodded and said, "Of course, have a great time," and went back to the dish I was washing. She left Friday. Philip came by Saturday to pick up some things from the garage, equipment from when he used to do home gym stuff that had been stored there for 2 years. He didn't knock. He had a key. I was in the kitchen and heard the side door open and assumed it was a neighbor, until I heard the garage grinding up. I went out. He nodded at me. Didn't say hello, just nodded, like I was a building he was passing. I went back inside. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold before I touched it, and I did something I hadn't done in 11 years. I took out a legal pad and started writing down numbers, not to punish anyone, not because I was planning anything, just because I needed to see it. I needed to know what I actually knew. By the time I finished, I had filled 2.5 pages. Property taxes for 11 years. Car cosign and unpaid transfers. Philip's cell line 4 years running is rent assistance. The lease guarantorship, which I'd looked up recently and found still had 8 months left on it. Tuition. Various loans that had been described as temporary and never revisited. Christmas gifts. Birthday gifts. The birthday gifts Philip never acknowledged. Graduation costs. A camping trip I'd funded because Philip and Joanna wanted to go together and cash was tight. The number at the bottom of the page was not a number I'm going to say out loud because it doesn't matter exactly. What matters is what I felt looking at it. Not anger. Not self-pity. Recognition. I recognized that I had confused paying for membership with actually being a member. I called my friend from my first career, a man named Douglas, who had been through a divorce of his own and had a habit of saying true things in the quietest possible voice. He picked up on the second ring. "You doing all right?" he asked. "I'm starting to be," I said. He understood what that meant. He'd said something similar to me once from the other side of it. We talked for an hour about nothing important, which was exactly what I needed. When we hung up, I felt steadier, not lighter. Steadier. Not lighter. Steadier. I didn't cancel anything that weekend. I didn't change passwords or move money. I went to church Sunday morning, came home, made lunch, and read a book I'd been meaning to finish for 6 months. I let the house be quiet. Monday I called my accountant. Not to do anything dramatic, just to understand clearly what was mine and what wasn't. The property was Joanna's. My name wasn't on the deed. I'd paid taxes on a house I didn't own. The car was co-signed, meaning the loan responsibility was mine even though the car wasn't. My name was on a lease for an apartment I'd never slept in. My credit carried risks I hadn't fully inventoried. My accountant, A precise woman named Beverly, who had been doing my taxes since my first marriage, listened to all of this without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Leonard, you've been operating as a financial guarantor for people who are not your dependents and have not treated you as a partner." I said, "I know. Do you want to fix that?" I said, "I want to start." Over the next 10 days, while Joanna came home from Savannah and life resumed its surface normalcy, I worked through a list, methodically, like an engineer. I consulted a family law attorney, just a single consultation, $200, to understand my options and exposure. I contacted the landlord of Philip's apartment and documented my position as guarantor, with a written notice that I would not be renewing when the lease term ended in May. I separated my personal accounts from the joint checking we used for household expenses. I contacted the cell carrier and removed Philip's line with 30 days' notice. I called the bank about the co-signed car loan and learned what it would take for Philip to refinance into his own name. None of this required confrontation. It was paperwork, forms, phone calls, the quiet machinery of undoing what had been done quietly in the other direction. I didn't tell Joanna, not yet. The telling came on a Thursday evening in October, not because I planned it for a Thursday, because Philip called while I was sitting across from her at dinner, and she answered it immediately, got up from the table, and walked into the bedroom to take the call. She was in there for 20 minutes. The food went cold. When she came back, she didn't apologize. She said, "He's stressed about his licensing exam." I said, "I know the feeling." She looked at me strangely. I looked back at her clearly. That was new. After dinner, she asked if something was wrong. I told her yes. She sat down. I told her what I had done over the past 10 days, not dramatically, not as an accusation, as a report the same way I described a project timeline at work for 3 decades. Here is what I found. Here is what I concluded. Here is what I have already changed, and here is what is in process. She stared at me for a long time. "You took Philip off the phone plan?" she said finally. "With 30 days' notice," I said. "He has time to set up his own. He's going to be furious." "He may be," I said. "That's between him and his phone carrier." "Duh, Leonard." She said my name the way people say it when they want it to function as an argument. I waited. "You can't just make these decisions unilaterally," she said. "We're married. These are family decisions." "They were made unilaterally the other direction for 11 years, I said. "I'm not sure when I became a voting member of this family, but it wasn't when these arrangements were set up. It was only when I was needed to fund them." She didn't have an answer for that. I hadn't expected one. I'd had 11 years to notice what she'd never had to. "I need you to understand something," I said, and I made sure my voice was level. "I'm not doing this to punish Philip. I'm not doing this to hurt you. I'm doing this because I've been participating in a structure that treated my contributions as guaranteed income and my presence as optional. That's not a marriage." She started to cry. Not loud, not dramatic. The quiet kind that's harder to watch. I waited. "I didn't think you felt that way," she said. "I know," I said. "Why didn't you say something?" I thought about the graduation. I thought about the dinner table and the texts. I thought about the Saturday Philip came to the garage without knocking and didn't say hello. "I said it in smaller ways for years," I said. "You heard what you needed to hear." Philip called that night. Joanna handed me the phone, which surprised me. He did not greet me. He said, "What's going on with the cell plan?" I told him it was being separated. I gave him the timeline. "Mom said you're pulling back on some other stuff, too." "I'm clarifying what I'm responsible for," I said. "I was guaranteeing things that aren't mine to guarantee." "You said you'd help me," he said. The edge in his voice was the same edge I'd heard for a decade. The one that assumed my help was a standing offer that didn't require reciprocity. I did help you, I said. For a long time. I'm not ending that help because I'm angry. I'm ending it because it was never meant to be permanent, and no one ever treated it like it was temporary. This is about the graduation speech, he said. Not a question. I paused. It's about a lot of things. The graduation is one of them. He was quiet. That surprised me. I didn't think about that, he said. Quieter. I know, I said. That's part of what I'm talking about. He didn't apologize. I hadn't expected him to. But the edge left his voice, which was something. The following weeks were uncomfortable in the way that honest things are uncomfortable. Joanna and I had conversations we should have had years earlier, conversations that felt like opening windows in a room that had been sealed for too long. Some of the air that came in was cold, some of it was necessary. She admitted she had leaned on my stability without examining what it cost me. She didn't say it that cleanly at first. It took 3 or 4 conversations. But she got there. I admitted that I had let resentment accumulate in silence, which is its own kind of dishonesty. I told myself I was being patient. Really, I'd been avoiding the discomfort of being known. I stayed in the house. I want to be clear about that. This is not a story about leaving. It's a story about what happens when you stop disappearing from a life you're technically living in. By November, the lease guarantorship was documented and set to expire. Philip had started the process of refinancing the car into his own name. It took longer than expected, required his mother to co-sign instead, which created its own set of conversations between them that I was not part of. The sell plan was separated. My personal accounts were distinct. The joint checking still existed, still covered household expenses, but the proportion was negotiated instead of assumed. For the first time in 11 years, I knew exactly what I was responsible for. That sounds like a small thing. It wasn't. Thanksgiving came. Joanna's sister came up from Savannah this time, which meant I met her properly for the first time in years, instead of being the person who stayed home. Philip came for dinner. He shook my hand when he arrived. Not warm, but real. He shook my hand like I was a man in the room, which was more than he'd given me in a long time. Dinner was fine, loud in places, awkward in 1 or 2 corners. Joanna put on music she knew I liked, which I noticed. I sat at the table I'd eaten at for 11 years and felt, for the first time, like I'd been invited. Not because I'd won anything, not because anyone had surrendered, because I'd stopped pretending I didn't have a seat when what I meant was that no one had offered me one. My daughter Claire called that evening. We talked for 40 minutes. She asked how things were going. I told her honestly, better. Different, like the house had been rearranged and I was learning where the furniture was. She laughed. She said, "Dad, you've sounded like a different person the last 2 months." I said, "I've been the same person. I just stopped editing him for the audience." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I've missed him." I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. Is a thing that happens when you spend years being useful. You start to think that's the price of admission, that if you stop being useful, you stop being welcome. And so you make yourself more useful and more, because the alternative, asking whether you're welcome just for being there, feels too risky to test. I had spent 11 years paying an entrance fee for a room I should have simply walked into. The accounting was never really about the money. It was about what the money represented. 11 years of choosing convenience over conversation. 11 years of assuming that if I handled things quietly, I was loved. I wasn't unloved. I think I was, but I was also taken for granted in the specific way that people take for granted the things that seem to run on their own. Joanna and I are still married. I want to say that plainly, because this story could read like a prelude to departure, and it isn't. It's a prelude to presence. There's a difference, and for a long time I didn't know it. What changed is not the roof over our heads or the name on any account. What changed is that I am now someone who says, when something costs me too much, this costs me too much, not as an accusation, as information. And Joanna, to her considerable credit, has started listening to that information instead of rerouting it. Philip and I are not close. I don't expect we will be. But at Christmas he came to the house, and when he left he stopped at the door and said, "Thanks for dinner, Leonard." Not Michael, not Leonard. It was the first time in 11 years he'd used my name on his way out of a room instead of on his way in asking for something. I said, "Come back anytime," and I meant it, because I meant it now for real, not from obligation. That's the thing nobody tells you about finally drawing a line. It doesn't close things. If it's done right, it opens them, not to what you had before, but to something more honest, something that can hold weight without pretending the weight isn't there. I'm 63 years old. I have a bad knee, a good accountant, a daughter who sends cards with sunflowers on them, and a wife who now passes the salt before I have to ask. It took me longer than it should have to understand that I deserved all of those things at once. If you're watching this and you know what it feels like to be needed in all the ways that don't include being known, I see you. The door you're looking for isn't an exit. It's just a door back into your own life. You don't have to blow anything up to walk through it. You just have to stop pretending you don't know where it is. I've thought a lot about what made me stay quiet for so long. Not the polite kind of quiet. The slow, accumulated kind that builds when you keep choosing the easier version of every conversation. I told myself I was being steady, patient. The kind of man who doesn't make a scene. But there's a version of patience that isn't a virtue at all. It's just fear wearing a respectable coat. What I did for 11 years wasn't love. It was audition. I kept showing up with my checkbook and my silence, hoping that eventually the room would turn around and acknowledge I was in it. It didn't. Rooms don't do that on their own. People don't do that on their own. You have to say, "I'm here, I matter." And when what I give costs me something real, I need that to be seen. Philip didn't thank me at that graduation because, in his mind, there was nothing unusual about what I had done. Money had appeared when he needed it. Problems had resolved themselves. That's what happens when someone handles things so consistently, so quietly, that the handling becomes invisible. I had made myself into infrastructure, and nobody thanks the water pipes. That's not Philip's fault entirely. That's what I had trained everyone around me to expect. The hard thing about cause and effect is that it rarely announces itself in the moment. You don't feel the pattern forming. You feel each individual choice. Cosign this, cover that, let this one go, and each one seems reasonable, generous even. It's only when you sit down with a legal pad at 63 years old and fill 2.5 pages that you see the shape of what you built, not a family, a dependency. And at the center of it, the person most dependent wasn't Philip or Joanna. It was me, dependent on being needed, dependent on usefulness as proof of worth. The moment I started untangling that, not with anger, but with clarity, things shifted. Not all at once, not dramatically, but Philip shook my hand at Thanksgiving. Joanna passes the salt now before I ask. These are small things. They are not small things. What I've come to understand, at this age, with this bad knee and this particular kind of hard-won quiet, is that integrity isn't just about keeping your word to other people. It's about keeping your word to yourself, about knowing what you actually agreed to and what you simply absorbed because no one was watching closely enough to stop you. I had let my generosity become a contract I never signed, and when I finally read the fine print, I had every right to renegotiate. That takes something, not courage in the dramatic sense. I didn't confront anyone in a parking lot. I didn't deliver a speech. It takes the slower kind of nerve. The kind that lets you sit with discomfort long enough to tell the truth about it, to say, this is what I've been doing. This is what it has cost me. This is where I stop. If you spent years being the person who holds things together without being held in return, I'm not here to tell you to walk away. I'm here to tell you that you're allowed to be known, not just useful. You're allowed to ask whether the people you love could pick you out of a room if you weren't carrying something they needed. Leonard could, eventually. And that made all the difference.